As you can see, I am in another place, another location in Germany, as I move from one part of Germany to another. And again, there are obviously going to be problems with the picture and perhaps the sound. And for that, also, I apologize. Also, I'm having to make these programs at irregular times. And of course, this means that I'm not perhaps quite as up to date with some events as I would like to be. Nonetheless, I'm going to continue to make these programs to the extent that I can for the remainder of my stay, which I expect to be completed this coming Thursday. Anyway, with that, let me now proceed with the remainder of this program, which, like all my recent programs, will be shorter than programs that I usually make when I am in London. Well, the first thing to say is that even as I am making this program, I'm receiving information from the exit polls about the results of the French parliamentary elections. And from what I can see, the results are very much in line with the opinion polls. Now, I say these are only exit poll results. Perhaps by the time this program is published, we'll have more up-to-date results, and they might differ significantly from what the exit polls, and before that, the opinion polls, were suggesting. But I have to say, I think this is unlikely. Firstly, it is clear, at least based on these results, that Marine Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National, has emerged as the biggest party in the French National Assembly, gaining over 34% of the vote. This is, of course, an increase over the 31% of the vote that the Rassemblement National party won in the recent elections to the European Parliament. Second has come the Popular Front, this assembly of various left-wing parties put together in order to contest this election in a tremendous hurry, partly in rivalry, it must be said, to Marine Le Pen's party, and they appear to have polled around 29% of the vote. Now, again, these are exit poll figures. These might be revised somewhat as the night proceeds. The third result, in third place, is President Macron's party, which has now fallen to around 22% of the vote, and which is obviously in third place. And then behind Macron's party, there is the fourth party, which is the Les Républicains, the party of what might call the establishment centre-right. So on the face of it, these figures show a clear win for Marine Le Pen's party, not enough, in my opinion, to gain a majority in the French Parliament, though we'll have to see, because the vagaries of the French election system make it not easy sometimes to predict how a percentage of the vote is going to translate into actual numbers of deputies in the French Parliament. But anyway, we'll have to see exactly how that works out. The important thing to take away from this is that two-thirds of the French have rejected conclusively President Macron's government. They voted either for parties on the right or for parties on the left. In both cases, these are parties which emphatically reject the course that President Macron has been following. And I would add the course that President Macron has been following in domestic policy, in economic policy, but also and clearly with respect to the conflict in Ukraine and the economic war against Russia. It's now clear that we're going to have a large bloc, a majority of parliamentarians in the French Parliament who have been elected by the French people in repudiation and rejection of these policies. Now, how exactly a government will be formed based on these figures? Presumably the next Prime Minister will be Jordan Bardella, the leader of the Rassemblement National in the French Parliament. But whether he'll be able to form a stable government, given the shortage perhaps of coalition partners for the Rassemblement National in the French National Assembly, how this government will function, how it will cooperate with President Macron, all of this is completely unclear for the moment. It's difficult to see the left-wing parties entering into coalition with the Rassemblement National. That's almost inconceivable, in fact. So it's likely that we're going to get a prolonged period of intense political uncertainty in France, with no clear end in sight, because, of course, the option of dissolving the parliament again and calling fresh elections is one which President Macron might not particularly relish. There is, it seems to me, a strong possibility that with his policies rejected, with a parliament that is now united against him, it's about the one thing the French Parliament is now united about. It is united in its hostility to President Macron, as of course is most of France. With that situation now having emerged, I still believe that there's a strong chance, a high probability, that President Macron himself might decide to leave office over the next few weeks, in which case we will presumably have presidential elections in France, and the outcome of those elections, there's a strong chance, will result in Marine Le Pen finally being elected President of France, though I perhaps ought to say that on the results of these figures, maybe that is not yet a foregone conclusion. Anyway, there we are. These are the French elections. And whatever happens over the next couple of weeks, we can say with confidence that the political situation in France is going to be unstable, that no one is in a position of complete dominance, and going forward to the July summit meeting of NATO, it's very far from clear that France will be able to speak with a clear voice. And of course, if President Macron turns up and represents France at the NATO summit meeting, as he presumably will, well, it's far from clear that he will go there as anything other than a lame duck president. So a very complex, very difficult result for NATO, for the European Union, for the United States, which has always regarded President Macron as a difficult and unstable, but nonetheless vital ally, certainly on Project Ukraine. Now, of course, it won't just be President Macron who will turn up at the NATO summit under a cloud. President Biden, as I discussed in my previous program, who will presumably be representing the United States at this summit, will also turn up under a cloud. Many questions about whether he should be standing for the presidency, about how long he will remain president of the United States, about his overall position, about his command of the political situation in the United States. One way or another, this is looking like a summit, a NATO summit of ghosts, a weakened United States president, lacking authority, lacking command, unable to lead the United States and to lead the United States in a positive direction and to make clear decisions about policy, and a French president who is now clearly a lame duck and whose authority has drained away and who might also be quitting the scene very soon. And all of this, even as the situation in the major crisis that NATO faces, the situation in Ukraine, deteriorates at an accelerating rate. And here we have significant and important news, because over the last 24 hours, there has been a cascade of reports about the situation on the ground in Ukraine, and for the NATO leaders gathering for their summit meeting, these reports must be making extremely grim reading indeed. Now, the way to summarize them is that we can see further and more the consequences of the aggressive attrition that the Russians have been conducting in Ukraine over the last 10 months or so, since the Ukrainian offensive petered out in October of last year. The Russians have been on the attack ever since then. They've captured important positions. They've captured Avdiivka. They've broken into Kharkiv region. They have made significant advances in other places. They captured Ocheretino as well. They have been, as I said, in a state of continuous advance since October, gaining more and more territory. But they have also been inflicting ever heavier losses on the Ukrainian army, losses that amount on certain days now, on many days now, to figures above 2,000 men dead and wounded on the Ukrainian side on any particular day. And, well, the results are now starting to show. Now, as we all know, the Russian army crossed into Kharkiv region back in May, before the Ukrainians expected that it would come. And it became immediately apparent that the defense lines in Kharkiv region, which we had been hearing so much about and which had been so talked up by Western commentators, to all intents and purposes, did not exist. If you take your mind, if you go back, reel back a couple of months to the period immediately following the fall of Avdiivka in February, the plan then was that Ukraine would retreat behind the great defensive lines, the fortified lines that it was busy building, and that with the assistance of long-range missile strikes on the Russians, it would stabilize the front lines, prevent the Russians from continuing their advances, bleed the Russians dry, and force the Russians eventually to agree to a freeze of the conflict. That was the plan that I remember hearing many people talking about at that time. Well, a couple of months later, it's clear that the fortified lines were a mirage, and that the Ukrainians, in order to try to hold the Russians back, in the absence of any fortified lines, have been forced to bleed their army dry. And this is what has been happening on battlefronts after battlefronts. And as of today, we can see that it is leading to a completely disastrous situation. Now let's look at what is going on every part of the contact line about which we have now had information. And let's start with Kharkiv region, which is the part of the battlefronts which have attracted the greatest amount of attention over the last few weeks, even though, as I have discussed in many programs, and as no less a person than President Putin has himself said, Kharkiv region ultimately is a sideshow. It is a secondary theatre in this conflict. The Russians have up to now forsworn plans to try to capture Kharkiv city itself, and by general consensus, they don't have enough men in Kharkiv region to carry out an offensive aimed at capturing Kharkiv city. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, since the beginning of June, in fact, we've been hearing report after report about the Ukrainians carrying out a major counteroffensive in precisely this area. There were reports that the Ukrainians were aiming to drive the Russians back across the border. This supposedly was part of what that NATO permission, that US permission, to allow the Ukrainians to conduct cross-border strikes on Russian forces across the border inside Russia itself using Western weapons was all about. And in fact, I even remember some reports, some claims that the Ukrainian offensive, when it took place, would be large and strongly supported and might aim not just to push the Russians back across the border, but might even press further into Russia and might seek nothing less than the capture of the big Russian city of Belgorod, which has been struck by Ukrainian artillery shells and missiles on numerous occasions over the last few weeks. Well, we've been hearing lots of reports about this, and the Ukrainians have indeed conducted various counterattacks. They've made various attempts in the Lipsy area, a village between the border and Kharkiv region, which is still under Kharkiv city, which is still under Ukrainian control. Anyway, they made various attempts close to Lipsy to recapture a village called Gluboka, which the Russians captured some weeks ago. And they've made sporadic attacks against this particular village, all of which have been unsuccessful. And there's been lots of confusing reports about the battles that have been happening in the much bigger and much more important town of Volchansk further east. Now, here, there's been lots of reports about fighting in the areas, in two particular areas, the area of the so-called high-rise buildings, which some refer to as the Citadel. This is in northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, and also in a battle for a series of factory buildings known as the aggregate plant, south of this area of high-rise buildings, but also in northern Volchansk. And the Ukrainians at various times have claimed that they've trapped, encircled the Russian troops in the aggregate plant, and that they're also attacking the Russians in eastern Volchansk, aiming to break into northern Volchansk, send tanks and armored vehicles into northern Volchansk, drive the Russians back, and prepare for the offensive that will not only secure Volchansk for Ukraine, but also push the Russians beyond the Volcha River. Now, I personally have always been very skeptical about these claims. They have been entirely contradictory to the reports that have been published every day by Group of Forces North, which on the contrary have suggested that in Volchansk at least, it is the Russians who hold the initiative. But we've had these contradictory reports, and as often happens, many people have been wondering where the truth might lie, and quite a number have tended to think that perhaps it was the Ukrainians who were telling the truth. Well, over the last 24 hours, we see that not only has Group of Forces North been telling us the real situation in Volchansk, but that for the Ukrainians it is in some ways even worse than what Group of Forces North has been implying. Firstly, a couple of days ago, Group of Forces North said that they had knocked the Ukrainians out of the area of the high-rise buildings, the so-called citadel. And then yesterday, we saw film of a Russian armored column, a column of tanks and armored vehicles operating south of the area of the high-rise buildings, where we would expect to see the Russians if they had indeed knocked the Ukrainians out of the buildings of the out of the high-rise buildings in the so-called citadel. The presence of these Russian tanks, where they appeared to be, discredited completely the Ukrainian claims made only the day before that the Russian troops in the aggregate plant were surrounded. Now, we've had more reports, more information since then, and more film and photographs. And these reports, these films and photographs, some of which come from the Ukrainian side, clearly show Russian troops in the area of the high-rise buildings. It does look as if fighting is still taking place in the area of the high-rise buildings. There are still Ukrainian soldiers defending there, but it is clear that the Russians are indeed sweeping through the area of the so-called Volchansk citadel, which looks like it is about to fall. Moreover, there are now reports which show Russian troops operating east of the high-rise building area, in effect having closed the supply routes from the Ukrainian forces to the remaining Ukrainian troops from the 71st Jaeger Brigade in the area of the high-rise buildings. If the Russians have not cleared this territory by now, they soon will, and it looks as if, far from the Russians being surrounded in the aggregate plant, it is clear that it is the Ukrainians instead who are surrounded in whatever remaining high-rise buildings in the citadel area in Volchansk that they still control. And it's not just in the area of the high-rise buildings that the Ukrainians are losing ground, and in other parts of northeastern Volchansk as well. It's also clear that the Russians, just as they say, are in the process of clearing the Ukrainians from the territory south of the aggregate plant as well, all the way to the Volcha River, somewhat to the south. Now, I remember that in a program I did about 2 weeks ago, when it became clear that, contrary to some earlier reports, there were indeed Ukrainian troops still holding out in northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, in the aggregate plant and in the area of the high-rise buildings. I said it looked to me, looking at the geography, that those Ukrainian troops were, to all intents and purposes, cut off from hope of resupply. And I think that the latest reports effectively confirm that this is indeed the case. The Ukrainians are cut off in northern Volchansk. Since I made that claim, their position has gone from bad to far, far worse, and I, for one, expect northern Volchansk to fall under Russian control very quickly. Anyway, that is the situation in the Volchansk-Kharkiv area. There is no sign of any Ukrainian offensive in this area. It is the Russians, on the contrary, who are clearly holding the initiative in Volchansk. They have surrounded Ukrainian troops in parts of northern Volchansk. They're clearing northern Volchansk, and it looks as if, exactly as Group of Forces North has been saying, Ukrainian resistance in northern Volchansk is in the process of collapsing. Elsewhere, the situation is, if possible, even worse. Elsewhere on the contact line. Now, yesterday, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed that a hotly contested village of Spornaya in the Siversk area has now finally been captured by the Russians. This village has changed hands several times before over the course of this war. The Russians captured it for a time in 2022. Then the Ukrainians recaptured it towards the end of their successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region in the autumn of 2022. Now the Russians have recaptured it, and I suspect recaptured it conclusively. I doubt that from this point on the Russians will be losing Spornaya again. And they haven't only captured Spornaya, as we know, some weeks ago they captured the other town, the other village to the north, Belogorovka, and a few days ago they also captured Rozdolovka. These are various villages located respectively to the south, east, and northeast of Siversk, all within striking distance of Siversk. And the Russians are also known to be advancing along one of the main railway lines towards another village called Vimka. In fact, they are now relatively close to Vimka, and with Spornaya having fallen, their advance towards Vimka is now protected on their eastern flank. So it looks as if Vimka will also fall fairly soon. Within the next few weeks, the battle for Siversk will start in earnest. And of course, if Siversk falls, that will all open the way for further Russian advances towards Liman, west of the Zherebets River, and obviously west of Siversk. And it will mean that the Russians once again, as they were briefly in the summer of 2022, are located on the outskirts of Slavyansk, the northern town of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. So the Russians made a significant advance now in the Siversk area, and this is strongly connected with the further news about more Russian advances in Chasiv Yar, which is further south. We've had more reports that the Russians have captured more buildings in the area of the micro district to the west of the aqueduct, and they have tightened their grip still further on the one supply road to the micro district from central Chasiv Yar, with the Russians also now strongly positioned on the flanks of Chasiv Yar, both to the north and to the south, with their troops beyond the aqueduct in both directions. Again, it looks to me as if the micro district is about to fall. Maybe there's some days, or perhaps a week or 2 weeks of intense fighting still left. But once that is over, the way will be open for an attack on Chasiv Yar from 3 directions. And I doubt that the Ukrainians have enough forces to resist that attack when it eventually comes. But then the news continues to get even worse, because we've now had more information from the Toretsk area to the south of Chasiv Yar. Toretsk, important town, about 30,000 people, located to the west of the Russian-controlled city of Gorlovka, one of the most heavily fortified towns along the front lines. The Ukrainians treated Toretsk as one of the major fortresses of their defense lines. And it was widely assumed that a frontal attack on Toretsk by the Russians was all but impossible. Well, we've been getting more reports which tell us the opposite. Firstly, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it looks as if the Russians managed to conduct a significant breakthrough over the previous 24 hours and advanced deep inside the Toretsk conurbation itself. Then later today, we got further news that apparently one of the reasons for this big breakthrough is that, again, as happened in Avdiivka, the Russians found an underground tunnel and sent special forces through that tunnel down a distance of 3 kilometers underground, and that enabled the Russians to emerge behind Ukrainian defense lines, opening the way for a Russian attack and for the Ukrainian forces at that point to collapse, the Ukrainian defenses to collapse. And today, we've got more reports still of more Russian advances in the Toretsk area. It looks as if the Russians, having reached New York from the south, as I understand it, this is another village which is part of the Toretsk conurbation, that they might also be attacking New York and this well-known fortified village from the northeast as well. Looks as if New York, in fact, might soon be entirely encircled by Russian forces. So a collapse apparently taking place in Toretsk at a speed which I think it's fair to say no one 2 or 3 weeks ago could have imagined. I remember when we first got the news of a Russian attack in the Toretsk direction, several people, myself included, wondered whether this news could possibly be true. It seemed for a while as if this was mainly chatter circulated by the Ukrainians themselves. It turns out that not only was there indeed a Russian offensive towards Toretsk, but it has proved all but irresistible. But, again, bad though the news in this area is, the news from the Avdiivka Ocheretino area turns out to be worse still. And here we can draw on information provided by the Ukrainians themselves, by the DS mapping project, which is connected in some way to the Ukrainian General Staff, to other Ukrainian mappers and bloggers, and cumulatively they tell us the same story, that the Russians have advanced further west of Ocheretino. The Russian Ministry of Defense now confirms that Novoalexandrovka has passed entirely under Russian control. But it looks as if the reason that the Russian Ministry of Defense has finally confirmed that piece of information about Russian control of Novoalexandrovka that we have always known is because the Russians have in fact captured other places to the south of Novoalexandrovka, securing the Russian positions in Novoalexandrovka and consolidating control of that village. Specifically, the Russians have now captured the villages of Sokol and Yevgenivka, the latter confirmed by a group of forces south, the Russian military command that is in charge of the Russian advance in this area as well. And the DS mapping project is now showing a large area of territory around these villages, which is now passed entirely under Russian control. These advances not only open the way for a Russian advance northwards towards the village of Vozdvizhenka, cutting the road from Pokrovsk to Chasov Yar, famous supply road, which apparently is so critically important to maintain the supplies of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. It actually brings the Russians within medium-range artillery range of Pokrovsk itself, which must now potentially be a target of a future Russian offensive at some point over the next few months. So, a disastrous situation in this area of the battlefronts, and one which has again developed at sudden speed. Now, there's probably more reports in other places. Fighting in Krasnogorovka continues. The Russians appear to be systematically clearing that town. As I said, as I discussed in my program yesterday, reports envisage the Russian capture of this town within the next few days or week, perhaps. And we're also getting reports of the Russians also advancing further south through the village of Maximilianovka towards Kurakhovo, another important town, another major logistical hub in this area as well. But, let's take a step back and look at the overall picture. We've been hearing a great deal over the last couple of weeks about how the decision by the US Congress back in March to authorize a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine was going to stabilize the military picture. We've received multiple reports about how a flood of weapons was going to arrive in Ukraine from the United States, from the European Union, which would enable the Ukrainians to stem the Russian advance. We had reports about 100,000 shells supposedly supplied through President Pavel of the Czech Republic's plan to buy shells on the international arms market. We've had reports at many occasions about F-16 fighter jets entering the battle sometime in June. We've had reports about the Ukrainians destroying the Crimean Bridge in the first half of this year. Well, I would just point out that as of the date of making of this video, which is the 1st of July, we are no longer in the first half of 2024, and the Crimean Bridge still stands. We've heard about a major Ukrainian offensive in the Kharkiv region, one which would drive the Russians back across the border and which would recapture, possibly even capture, the Russian city of Belgorod itself. We've had reports about Ukrainian attacks on Russian positions deep inside Russia with ATACMS missiles and other types of systems, which would be a game changer. We've had one report after another over the last couple of weeks, all of which have been telling us that even if the Russians have been making advances, the situation in Ukraine is still within stalemate, that the Ukrainians are still somehow holding their positions, that the Russian offensive is running out of steam, and that the Ukrainians might soon be back on the offensive again. None of this has borne any relation to the actual reality. Throughout all of the time that all of these claims and reports have appeared in the Western media and in Ukrainian Telegram channels, the reality is of terrible Ukrainian losses, the Ukrainian army losing men at a rate of 2,000 a day, according to the Russians, but that claim is probably true. We've seen a massive destruction of Ukraine's artillery systems, its artillery guns. The Russians have conducted a huge campaign of destruction of Ukraine's artillery systems. We've seen a graveyard of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles, especially in the area to the west of Ocheretino and Avdiivka. And we've also seen that the famous fortified lines, about which we've been hearing so much, that they are simply or largely a figment of reporters' imaginations. The fact is that the Russians have been able to maintain the pace of their offensive, which is what essentially we are looking at, and that they've been able to do this continuously since October. Of course, there are moments when the offensive advances faster, and other moments when the Russians pause in order to reinforce and reorganize, and most probably to build up their logistic systems in order to make possible further advances. But overall, the story is of a steady, systematic, relentless Russian advance, which, moreover, has been accompanied by the steady destruction of the Ukrainian army and of its of the infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure upon which it and indeed Ukraine itself depends. And alongside all of that, we have seen a further massive degradation of Ukrainian society, as in a fruitless, hopeless attempt to try to stem this Russian advance, the Ukrainian authorities, under relentless Western pressure, have extended their mobilization program to include sections of Ukrainian society which should never have been called up to fight in any war, let alone this one. All of those commentators, pundits, analysts, writers who've poured out article after article, coming up with some kind of plan for Ukraine to achieve victory on the battlefield, who have been claiming or pretending that the situation is not as bad as it seems, who talk about how another infusion of Western weapons, another supply of shells, a couple more drones, a few more missile strikes on Crimea, some cross-border raids into Russia. All of these commentators who have been spreading these stories and writing these articles, which have been churned out endlessly in the Western media, have been engaged in fact, as we now see, in a total denial of the reality of the situation. Now, I've been saying for weeks that if you follow the war closely, not an easy or forgiving thing to do, but if you do follow the war closely, if you spend hours of your time, as I have been doing, listening to the various reports and commentaries from those people who actually have a genuine understanding of what has been going on the battlefronts, the actual reporters and commentators on each of the two sides. If you've been doing that, you gradually acquire a feeling for the state of the battle. And the feeling that I have increasingly had over the last couple of months is that we have now, in terms of the war, definitely passed the pivot point, the point of no return, when it becomes clear that Ukraine is facing not just a grinding wall of attrition of the kind that the Russians started to wage against Ukraine from the spring of 2022, but rather a situation not of stalemate, but of checkmate, of eventual complete military collapse. And we are coming closer to that point at a far greater speed than I think Western commentators and indeed Western governments fully understand. Now, in a couple of days, we're going to get a NATO summit meeting in which, as I said, President Macron of France, rejected by the French people, President Biden of the United States, well, not yet rejected by the American people, but facing calls to step down from his own party, and other Western leaders, none of whom, to be frank, look remotely convincing or up to this situation, are going to come together, first and foremost, to discuss the situation in Ukraine. I seriously question whether any one of these people who are going to attend this meeting have any genuine understanding of what is really happening on the battlefronts. If they did, they would hardly be speaking about the conflict in the way that they continue to do, as if Ukraine can somehow be supported to the point where it can be defended, or alternatively, as if a solution to this conflict is some kind of freeze idea of the kind that has been floated by various US officials since the spring of last year. All of these talk about a successful defense of Ukraine or a freeze of the conflict along the conflict line, a conflict line which, by the way, is constantly shifting now. All of this, as far as I'm concerned, is complete pie in the sky. Now, the time is long overdue for recognition of this reality and for that decision to start negotiations. And the only basis upon which these negotiations can take place are the ones that were outlined by President Putin 2 weeks ago. This is for the Ukrainians to announce that they are complying with, in effect, President Putin's demand or ultimatum, if you prefer, and are now withdrawing all their forces from Donbass and also from Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. That is what needs to be done forthwith. There also needs to be an immediate acceptance of the reality, a reality which incredibly everybody privately accepts, but no one is prepared to voice, that Ukraine is never going to join NATO, and in my opinion, by the way, is never going to join the European Union either. Why would the European Union want a Ukraine that is shattered and broken, especially if that Ukraine is never going to join NATO, which is what Project Ukraine ultimately has always been all about? So, these concessions that some people say are unacceptable, in my opinion, they're not unacceptable at all. There's simply a recognition of the existing reality. If these concessions are not made, all that is going to happen is that the Russians are going to drive the Ukrainians out, first of Donbass, and then out of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions as well. Kherson region by most accounts, Western Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, by most accounts from people who know, is now largely undefended. The Ukrainians have had to withdraw nearly all of the troops they formerly had there in order to try to hold the positions in the contact lines. When the Russians decide that the time has come for them to advance back into Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, they are unlikely to meet any significant resistance at all. That is the reality. Again, a reality which for the moment no one seems to be willing to face. Anyway, to repeat, if the underlying realities of the military situation are not faced, all that is going to do is doom the Ukrainians to a situation where they're going to be driven out of the four regions by the Russians, and where that will happen at the cost of tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. Bear in mind that Ukraine is currently losing in excess of 10,000 men each week on the battlefronts, dead and wounded. Now, of course, people can come up with alternative plans to deploy Western troops to Ukraine. The European Parliament elections and the elections which have just taken place in France, and by the way, the mood which I have noticed in Germany, make it absolutely clear to me that the European public is in no way prepared to send its young men to fight in Ukraine against the Russian army. I believe the same is true in the United States as well. Any Western politician who starts to push for such a desperate plan is not only risking World War III, he or she is risking a major revolt from the European electorates. So, again, that is a far-fetched, indeed preposterous, and very dangerous idea. President Putin has provided a route towards negotiations. It is not an attractive one for Western governments to go for. Far better if Ukraine had been allowed to settle its conflict with Russia in March and April of 2022, as almost happened. Better still if the Minsk II agreement had been implemented in full, as Ukraine, of course, committed itself to do, and as the Western powers said they supported. But we are where we are. Time is running very short now. And of course, if the Russians do drive the Ukrainians out of the four regions, or at least out of Donbass, and establish themselves in Kharkiv region, perhaps eventually even taking Kharkiv city itself, well, President Putin has already said that the terms that he has outlined might change and not in Ukraine's favor, and that is exactly the direction which we are now taking. So, at this summit of exhausted, discredited leaders that we are about to have, what the NATO leaders need to finally do is to accept the reality, to agree that some kind of communication with the Kremlin must now be established, and a serious approach towards negotiations must now begin. Does anybody think that that will happen? Does anybody think that President Biden, in his present state, is capable of conducting such a negotiation? Does anybody think that President Macron, would be able to support such a negotiation if it were to take place? Does anybody think that the discredited and fractured government in Germany would survive a negotiating process and would be prepared to undertake it? I do not. But that doesn't alter what I have said about the urgency of the situation. And I would suggest that in the United States, where certain important decisions are going to have to be made over the next few weeks, both about the conflict in Ukraine and about the presidency itself, those who are making those decisions need to consider first and foremost the realities in Ukraine, the relations between the United States and Russia, and the president's ability to face realities and to make the decisions which only the President of the United States can make. Well, that is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can check out, you can find us on all our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can check out our shop, where we're still doing our Football 24 series. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And please also remember that you can, if you've liked this video, despite all the bad pictures and perhaps indifferent sound quality and all the rest, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.